Yes, indeed, Cambrian life. All right, the Cambrian is considered to be the bottom of the pile in terms of the evolutionary progression. So it's supposedly filled with primitive bottom-dwelling creatures, very simple forms of life. But as we actually study them, we don't find simple things at all. We find a lot of complexity. So here are three particular examples. Uh, the first one is about eyes, which are supposedly 520 million years old. And they found this particular organism here called Cinderella, and that's not a typo. That is what it is actually called. Mind you, you will get very frustrated if you look for information about this creature doing an internet search, because the search engine will always try to change your search to Cinderella, as in the fairy tale. But we're not into fairy tales. We're into facts here. And so this fossil does actually exist, and it was found to have some rather interesting eyes. It's got compound eyes. Now, you may have heard of compound eyes. You've probably seen some of them. You've got to get quite close up to look at them. But insects and lots of other creatures have compound eyes, which means they're made up of a whole lot of little optic units called omatida, and they are like a whole lot of little hexagonal systems with a lens at the top, and then all of those are connected to the insect's brain or to the animal's brain. So an animal that has a big compound eye also has to have a brain that's able to process the information. And in one of our recent programs, we did actually talk about finding the oldest fossil brain, which was also dated as being Cambrian. And now that we have different ways of studying fossils using particular scanning devices and X-rays, we can find a lot of details in these things. And there's nothing primitive about this creature with its compound eyes. In fact, it's got over 2,000 of these segments in its eyes. And the scientists who discovered it made this comment. Fossil specimens with eyes mostly belong to arthropods, so that's jointed-legged insects and other creatures that have a hard exoskeleton, thus supporting the hypothesis that good vision triggered arthropod diversity and domination in the early Cambrian ecosystems. And the origin and evolution of good vision formed the foundation of modern benthic, meaning deep sea ecosystems in the Cambrian oceans. Now, notice the logic here, that these things evolved good vision, so that enabled the other things to diversify, because having good vision meant that they were good hunters, so they were good at finding foods. Now, this is the sort of upside down logic that you get from the evolutionists. They have this conclusion that somehow one animal got good vision, and that triggered arthropod diversity. Well, what do they mean by that? And don't be afraid to actually ask the evolutionists when they make statements like this, how would that happen? How does good vision in one creature make other things diversify or make other things evolve? In order for other things to change, they have to have their genes change. So that's not going to happen. Now let's move on to, so that's the question that we should be asking people. You know, how does good vision in one animal enable others to evolve? Now here are some, those ones weren't found in the Burgess Shale, which John has just been talking about, but the most famous piece of Cambrian rocks are the Burgess Shale, and here's something that was found in the Burgess Shale. Now, what do you think these are? In fact, this part of the Burgess Shale is sometimes called the tulip beds, because these things look like tulips, but they're not. They're actual animals, And this is a report from a paper, which is an open access paper. You can go and look at this, and it's called A New Stalked Filter Feeder from the Middle Cambrian Burgess Shale in British Columbia, Canada. So a filter feeder is a type of animal that feeds by just sifting the seawater through it. So it has to have some means of actually getting water to flow through it, and it just filters out the little microorganisms and other tiny things that might be in the water. And so the scientists have had a good look at these, and they've found that they've got quite a complex internal structure. And but they do have ultimately a shape that does look a bit like a tulip. So here is a fossil or a reconstruction of what these things look like. And when they were studying these creatures and wondering, well, how are we going to classify them? Because we like to classify things, we like to name things. And the evolutionists got into a bit of a pickle here, because they said most interesting is that the feeding system appears to be unique among animals. In other words, here's something that we haven't found before in living things or in fossil things. We do not know where it fits in relation to other organisms. So that they have this obsession. We have to fit it somewhere into an evolutionary tree, because their belief is that the classification system actually represents evolution. It doesn't. In fact, the classification system was designed by someone who believed in creation. It was just a means of organizing our knowledge. Later on, the evolutionists took it over and tried to make links between things that were similar and put things that were different on other branches of the evolution of their tree diagram, but they just couldn't find a place to put this one. Now, that's not a problem for us, of course, because if God created things according to their kind as separate kinds, and they have then multiplied after their kind. Sadly, these things have then died out. There's no evidence that they've ever turned into anything else. Not a problem for us, but it is a perpetual problem for the evolutionists. And the other interesting thing about this fossil bed is that they actually admit that this was a mass burial. And so in the paper that I've referred to there, they did actually carefully map out this slab of fossils and came to the conclusion that they were probably buried en masse, more or less in situ, in other words, in the place where they're found there in this mass by rapid mud flow events. So when it does come to the crunch, they admit that there are rapid processes they just cannot avoid. These things were not buried slowly and gradually. They were all jumbled up together and dumped, just like we find in lots of other places as well. Now, if we can just come back to us, because I have something to show you here for the moment. Yes, here we are. The next thing we want to talk about is a creature that was written up in this, like, put it in front of my camera here. Can you see there's a picture there of three things? One is a space rocket, one is an octopus, and the other is a reconstruction of a rather weird-looking creature that looks like a kite with a funnel at the front. Now, any idea what these things all might have in common? And if we go back to the slides now, thanks, Joseph. Any idea what they might have in common? Let's move on, if we can.
There you go, your slides up.
Thank you. Yes, let's move on. This is about the oldest jet propulsion. And that's what those three things that I just showed you in that article from Nature supposedly have in common. They all have a funnel for jet propulsion. And this refers to another fossil from the Burgess Shale from the Cambrian that's dated about 505 million years old. And you can see there a reconstruction of this rather flat-looking creature with two tentacles sticking out the front and a nozzle-shaped structure at the front. And they, looking at this fossil, they've decided that this is the oldest example of jet propulsion, just like squid, probably more familiar with, can move around by jet propulsion. And this is considered to be the oldest cephalopod because it's dated by being in the Burgess Shale as being 505 million years ago. So again, we found it in the Burgess Shale. The Burgess Shale has already been dated as 505 million years. Or if you're walking very slowly like Vance Nelson, 535 million years old, whatever. Therefore, this creature must be that old. And in fact, it's a soft-bodied animal, a bit like an octopus or a squid. And again, you don't bury soft-bodied creatures slowly and gradually because they just turn to mush. You have to bury them quickly. But the interesting thing about this is that it has this funnel for jet propulsion. And in that article that I held up there with the photo of the space rocket and the octopus, you'll find this comment. Cephalopods uniquely among animals have invented, that's very clever, isn't it? Have invented directed jet propulsion by the effective use of a funnel or a siphon through which water can be expelled from a body cavity at high speed in any direction. Now, isn't that amazing? Have you ever seen an octopus invent anything? Who invented the space rocket? It certainly didn't evolve by itself. The Americans have spent billions in taxpayers' money developing the space rocket that was in that photo. It was actually a space shuttle launch rocket. And so have governments all around the world spent billions building rockets. They didn't invent themselves any more than this cephalopod, however old you want to make it, it didn't invent the jet propulsion either any more than a modern day octopus did. Now, in the Burgess Shale, there are lots of wonderful things. In the Cambrian rocks, there are lots of amazing creatures. It is really sad that they have died out. Now, quite a few years ago, a man named Stephen Jay Gould, who you may have heard of, he died in 2002. But anyway, he described the Burgess Shale as being filled with wonderful life. And he even wrote a book about it called Wonderful Life. And in some museums, you will see dioramas and mock-ups showing the sorts of creatures that you do have in the Burgess Shale. They were not primitive or simple in anything. They were quite complex animals. A lot of them are very different to the sorts of things that we have now. That does not mean they evolved into anything else. Sadly, they have just died out, which again is evidence that fits into the biblical history of the world, that it's going downhill. It used to be full of wonderful, complex, beautiful, amazing creatures, and a lot of them have died out. The world is going downhill. We are losing biodiversity. There's no evidence that these ever evolved into anything else. They were fully formed, fully functional creatures, and the more we look at them, the more complexity we find. We don't find anything simple about them at all. So it is wonderful life, but of course, even more wonderful is the God who made them. We see evidence of design in dead things, in fossil things, as much as we see in living things. And I think we should join with the psalmist, who said, "One generation shall commend your works to one another." And that's what we like to do at Creation Research. We found all these amazing things through our own research, through looking at the research that's put out by the scientific news services. And we love to tell people about it because the study of living world is a fascinating thing. And you will see the mighty acts of the word. And it's a good thing to meditate, in other words, to think of the wondrous works of the Lord. On the glorious splendor of your majesty and on your wondrous works I will meditate. Yes, there is wonderful life in the living world, in the buried fossil world, and that both of those are evidence that they were made by a wonderful God. And if we're a wonderful creator,